The boy who helped a millionaire bitten by a venomous snake. The next day a Maybach appeared in front of his house. The afternoon sky was ablaze with sunlight, but Frank's mood was quite the opposite. He had just escaped a tense meeting and decided to drive away from the city in search of some peace. His luxury car sped along a narrow road leading to a remote countryside. His eyes were fixed on the road, but his mind was cluttered with numbers, contracts, and work-related pressures. "How long has it been since I stopped to breathe?" Frank muttered to himself. A small smile crept across his face as he saw a golden wheat field stretching out before him. Unable to resist the allure of the scenery, he pulled his car to the side of the road and stepped out. A peaceful atmosphere enveloped everything. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wild grass. Frank walked along the narrow dirt path, his polished shoes quickly getting smeared with mud. He thought stepping away from the pressures of work would help him regain his balance. But as he paused to take a deep breath, a sudden sharp pain radiated from his ankle. "Ah!" Frank cried out, reflexively pulling his leg back. Looking down, he saw a small brown snake slithering quickly into the grass. Two tiny red puncture marks stood out vividly on his skin. Frank panicked. He tried to stay calm, recalling what he had read about venomous snakes. Don't panic, don't let the blood flow faster, but theory was of little use as fear began to overwhelm his mind. He fumbled for his phone in his pocket, but when the screen displayed no signal, his heart pounded like a drum. Frank tried to hobble back toward his car, but each step became increasingly difficult. The venom seemed to be spreading, making his leg ache and go numb. He stumbled and sank to the ground, cold sweat breaking out all over his face. "Help, someone help me," he shouted, but only the wind responded. Just when Frank thought all hope was lost, a faint sound echoed in the distance. It was the sound of footsteps, light but distinct. Frank opened his eyes, trying to focus on the source of the sound, but the fading light of the sunset made it hard to see. "Someone, please," Frank whispered, his voice raspy. A small figure appeared in the distance, moving closer to him. The person stopped and looked at Frank lying motionless on the ground. "Are you okay?" A young but firm voice called out. Frank looked up. Standing before him was a boy, around 14 years old, with messy brown hair and bright, intelligent eyes. He wore an old t-shirt and jeans, looking as though he had just returned from some adventure. Snake bite," Frank stammered, trying to point to his leg. The boy immediately crouched down to examine the wound. His face was unnervingly calm, showing no fear or panic. "You've been bitten by a snake. We need to act quickly," the boy said with unwavering confidence. Frank wanted to say something else, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Each breath grew harder, and everything around him started to blur. "Stay awake," the boy barked softly, shaking Frank's shoulder. "You can't fall asleep now, understand? I'll help you, but you have to trust me." Frank managed a weak nod, though doubt lingered in his mind. Who could trust a mere child? But in this situation, he had no other choice. Who are you?" Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "My name's Luke," the boy replied quickly. "My father is a medic. I know first aid, and I'm going to help you survive this. Don't worry." Frank couldn't respond. He could only feel Luke's small but steady hands as they began tending to his wound. In the fragile moment between life and death, Frank never imagined his hope would rest in the hands of a boy seemingly unafraid of danger. Luke quickly assessed the wound on Frank's leg, his eyes glowing with intense focus. The bite marks were deep, and the red swelling around them clearly indicated venom spreading. "Listen carefully. You need to stay calm," Luke said, his tone far more commanding than his small stature suggested. "I'm going to do my best to help you, but you need to follow my instructions." Frank barely nodded, his body almost lifeless. His half-open eyes betrayed doubt and fear, but Luke had no time to persuade him. "First, don't move your leg anymore. The venom will spread faster if blood circulation increases. Luke pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and quickly tied it tightly around Frank's thigh, about 2 inches above the bite. "What are you doing?" Frank murmured, his voice trembling. "A tourniquet. I have to stop the venom from spreading upward," Luke explained briefly. He grabbed a nearby stick to tighten the makeshift bandage, twisting it securely. The pain in Frank's leg made him groan, his face drenched in sweat. But Luke didn't stop. He continued checking Frank's condition. "Your leg needs to stay lower than your heart, like this." Luke gently adjusted Frank's posture, placing his leg on the ground. "This will slow down blood circulation." "Where did you learn this?" Frank asked, his breath uneven. "My father's a medic," Luke replied quickly while keeping his attention on the task. "I've helped him in a few emergencies back in the village. But I've never dealt with a venomous snake before." Frank wanted to say something, but the pain and exhaustion kept him silent. Luke continued working, his hands trembling slightly as he unfastened a water bottle from his belt to check its contents. "You can't drink water right now, but I need to clean the wound." Luke poured a small amount of water over the bite, then used a clean cloth to gently wipe it. His face remained calm, but inside, he was filled with worry. "Do you think you can do this?" Frank asked weakly. "I have to." "There's no other choice," Luke replied, his eyes flashing with determination. "But you need to stay strong. If you give up, there's nothing I can do." Frank fell silent. Luke's words rang like a command, forcing him to fight to stay conscious. But every passing second made his body feel heavier, and the pain grew more excruciating. Luke reached into his bag and pulled out a small rope. He used it to secure Frank's leg, preventing any involuntary movement. "How long ago did the snake bite you?" Luke asked. Not long. Maybe 15 minutes, Frank stammered. Luke nodded. "We still have time. But I need to get you to an adult or a medical station as soon as possible. It's not safe here." Frank looked at the boy, his eyes fading but still filled with doubt. "You're just a kid. How can I trust you?" Luke paused and stared straight into Frank's eyes. "You don't have a choice. I'm here, and I'm not letting you die." Luke's firm tone left Frank with nothing more to say. The boy stood up, scanning the remote, desolate area. He knew he couldn't let this situation drag on any longer. "Save your strength. I'm going to carry you," Luke said as he adjusted the strap on his shoulder. Frank's eyes widened. "You're crazy. I'm too heavy for you." "It doesn't matter. Just don't struggle or move." Luke crouched down and hoisted Frank onto his back. Despite his thin and seemingly frail frame compared to Frank's larger body, Luke didn't hesitate. Taking a deep breath, he lifted Frank with all the strength he had. "I can't stop. I have to save him," Luke murmured, trudging along the uneven dirt path. Frank could feel the vibrations of Luke's steps. Each one was a Herculean effort, and Frank couldn't help but feel admiration. "You don't have to do this," Frank said softly. "I'm just a stranger." "No, you're not just a stranger," Luke interrupted. "If I don't help you, who will? Out here, we can only rely on each other." Those words struck a chord in Frank's mind. He realized that, in these life and death moments, everything he once thought mattered, money, status, power, suddenly felt meaningless. The two continued forward, even as Luke began to tire. Sweat poured down the boy's face, and each step seemed heavier than the last. "You don't have to sacrifice so much," Frank said, his voice breaking. Luke remained silent. He knew that stopping would mean the end for Frank. As the evening faded into dusk, darkness began to envelop them. But within Luke burned a small yet powerful flame of determination. Darkness blanketed the narrow dirt road as Luke and Frank struggled onward. Cold wind swept across the fields, sending shivers down Luke's spine, but he refused to stop. Frank lay on Luke's back, gasping for breath, his body growing heavier by the minute. "Put me down," Frank whispered weakly. "You can't carry me forever." Luke gritted his teeth, panting heavily but keeping his gaze resolute. "No. I'm not giving up. We'll make it to the medical station. I promise." Luke's simple but determined response silenced Frank. He wasn't sure if he was surviving because of the boy's extraordinary strength or if it was Luke's unwavering spirit keeping him conscious. Luke's steps grew heavier. His worn shoes sank into the soft earth, and the biting wind seemed intent on defeating them both. Yet Luke's mind was fixed on one thought: I must save him. "Do you think we'll make it in time?" Frank asked weakly. Luke didn't look back and answered firmly. "We will. But you need to stay awake. Don't fall asleep, do you hear me?" Frank nodded faintly, fighting the drowsiness creeping over him. The venom had rendered his body numb, and every breath felt like a battle. Yet Luke's strong voice tethered him to reality. "You're just a kid," Frank murmured. "How can you do all this?" Luke paused briefly to adjust Frank on his back. Turning his head, his eyes were filled with unwavering determination. "I don't have a choice. If my father were here, he would do the same thing. He always said that in emergencies, hesitation isn't an option." Frank gazed into Luke's eyes and saw no fear, only a strange and profound courage. A pang of shame passed through Frank's mind. He had spent his life relying on wealth and power, but now his survival depended entirely on a boy armed with nothing but sheer willpower. "You're a remarkable boy," Frank said, his voice choking with emotion. Luke didn't reply. He couldn't afford to be distracted. His mind was solely focused on finding the medical station. Yet every step felt longer and more grueling, and he knew time was running out. As the last rays of sunlight vanished, Luke relied on the faint glow of a small flashlight strapped to his backpack. The road ahead grew rougher, littered with deep ruts and sharp rocks. Every step was a challenge, but Luke pressed on, even as his legs began to tremble. "I have to keep going. I can't stop," he murmured to himself, as if reminding his body to move. Frank felt Luke's determination, but he knew the situation was becoming dire. His breathing grew labored, and his mind started to drift. "Luke," Frank whispered, his voice so faint it was barely audible. "If I don't make it." "No. You will make it." Luke cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "Don't say things like that. I didn't carry you this far to hear you give up." Frank managed a faint smile, though it was full of exhaustion. "You're so stubborn, but I think I'm grateful for it." Luke didn't respond. He couldn't allow himself to lose focus. His thoughts were entirely on getting to the medical station. But each step grew harder, each second ticking away like a clock winding down. A chirp from an insect in the nearby field startled Luke. He stopped, scanning the surroundings under the dim light. "Is something wrong?" Frank asked, noticing Luke's hesitation. "No, it's just I think we need to move faster," Luke replied, his voice trembling slightly. Frank could sense the worry in Luke's tone but had no idea how to help. His body was entirely unresponsive, and he had no choice but to rely on Luke to keep going. "Luke," Frank called softly. "What?" "If you can't, you don't have to keep going. Be quiet." Luke snapped, startling Frank. "I told you, I'm not leaving you behind. If you say that one more time, I won't listen." Frank fell silent. For the first time in his life, he felt the power of someone else's unyielding determination. Luke's steps grew heavier still. Sweat dripped down his face, but he didn't stop. In his mind, there was only one goal: to get Frank to safety. When a faint light appeared in the distance, Luke exhaled a small sigh of relief. We're almost there. Hold on just a little longer. Frank didn't reply. His eyes were half closed, and Luke had to shake his shoulder to keep him awake. You can't sleep. Do you hear me? Luke shouted, his voice echoing through the still night. Frank barely opened his eyes, struggling to respond. You. Luke, thank you. Luke didn't reply, tightening his grip to keep Frank securely on his back. Despite the pain coursing through his entire body, he kept moving forward. The small silhouette of Luke, carrying a man far larger than himself, was like a faint glimmer of light in the pitch-black night. The dim glow in the distance was their only beacon of hope amidst the suffocating darkness surrounding them. Luke poured all his remaining strength into every step, his heavy feet refusing to stop. The night's chill seeped through his thin clothes, making his body tremble, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. We're almost there, Luke whispered, more to encourage himself than to speak to Frank. Frank remained limp on Luke's back. His breaths were faint and labored, each one a painful effort. He could no longer speak clearly, but faint murmurs escaped his lips. Don't leave me, kid. Nobody's leaving anyone, Luke replied, his voice shaking with exhaustion. You just need to stay awake a little longer. We're almost safe. Luke adjusted his backpack straps, keeping Frank stable on his back. Each step was a battle against his own body, but Luke pushed away any negative thoughts. His face was tight with determination, his eyes fixed on the light ahead. I have to make it. I have to save him, he whispered to himself, his breath coming in short gasps. The road grew increasingly treacherous. Under the weak beam of his small flashlight, Luke could see sunken patches of dirt and sharp rocks scattered along the path. But he had no other choice. Each slip or stumble sent jolts of pain through his exhausted legs. He had to pause a few times to catch his breath, but the biting cold forced him to keep moving. Frank mumbled something, but Luke couldn't make it out. He bent down slightly and loosened the rope that kept Frank secured to his back. What did you say? Luke asked, his voice still steady despite his exhaustion. You're insane, Frank murmured, his lips pale. A boy, doing this, for a stranger. Luke pressed his lips together tightly, his eyes flashing with determination. I don't see it that way. I'm just doing what I have to do. If I left you behind, I wouldn't deserve to be my father's son. Frank fell silent. Luke's words struck him like a splash of cold water. He had spent his entire life calculating risks and benefits, weighing every decision by what he could gain or lose. Yet here, in the middle of this dark, desolate night, a boy he had never met was willing to sacrifice everything to save him, without any reason or promise of reward. Your father must be so proud of you, Frank whispered faintly. Luke didn't respond. He knew that if he let himself dwell on those words, his legs might refuse to carry him any farther. He took a deep breath, focusing on the sole goal ahead, getting Frank to safety. As the distance to the faint light shrank, Luke realized it wasn't a medical station after all, it was a small house in the middle of the field. Light spilled from its windows, illuminating a narrow dirt path leading to the front door. Luke froze, disappointed that his only hope wasn't the destination he had envisioned. It's not a medical station, Luke murmured. Frank, barely coherent, sensed Luke had stopped. Why did you stop? It's nothing, Luke replied firmly. We're moving on. Luke decided not to stop at the house. If it belonged to a farming family, they likely wouldn't have the means to help Frank. Instead, Luke turned back to the main road, trying to recall the map he had briefly seen on his phone earlier. I remember seeing a sign, maybe a few kilometers from here, Luke muttered to himself. His legs grew heavier with each step, as if they were about to collapse. But Luke refused to stop. He had to get Frank to safety, even as his own body began to betray him. Suddenly, a sound broke through the quiet night, a motor engine rumbling in the distance. Luke's head snapped up, his eyes lighting with hope. "There's someone." "A car," he yelled, his voice cracking. Frank's lips curved faintly, as if attempting a smile. "Finally, you're lucky." Luke turned toward the approaching lights, though they were still far away. He gently set Frank down and stood up, waving his arms and shouting at the top of his lungs. "Help! Please stop! Someone needs help!" His voice was desperate, echoing into the night. At first, the car didn't slow down, and Luke's heart sank. He waved harder, stepping into the middle of the road to block its path. "Please! We need help!" The car finally slowed down, its headlights blinding Luke momentarily. The engine rumbled softly as the vehicle came to a halt. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out. "What's going on? What are you doing out here at this hour?" the man asked, his deep voice filled with surprise. Luke didn't answer immediately, instead pointing toward Frank, who lay motionless on the ground. "Please, he's been bitten by a venomous snake. I need to get him to a medical station immediately," Luke pleaded, his voice shaking. The man glanced at Frank, then back at Luke. "All right, let's get him in the car. Quickly." Without another word, Luke lifted Frank onto his back once again, helping the man get him into the car. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the narrow dirt road toward the nearest medical facility. The car raced through the night, its headlights illuminating obstacles in their path. Luke sat in the back seat, holding Frank steady on the bench. He constantly checked his breathing and pulse, despite the cold sweat dripping down his face. "Please, drive faster," Luke shouted to the man behind the wheel, his voice trembling with urgency. "I'm going as fast as I can," the man replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Frank lay still, his eyes half open but unfocused. His lips were pale, and his breaths grew shallower. Luke leaned in close, gently shaking his shoulder. "Mr. Frank. You need to stay awake. Don't fall asleep," Luke shouted, his voice breaking. Frank barely opened his eyes, struggling to respond. "Kid. I'm so tired." "No. You can't sleep." Luke gripped Frank's hand tightly, his voice quivering. "You have to listen to me, just a little longer. We're almost there." Frank nodded faintly, but it was clear he was fighting against his own body. Pain, exhaustion, and venom were wearing him down with every passing second. Luke bit his lip, his eyes fixed on every small movement Frank made, as if a single moment of stillness would mean life slipping away forever. "What's your name?" the driver asked, breaking the heavy silence. "Luke," he replied curtly, his eyes never leaving Frank. "Luke, you're doing great. Keep him awake, we're almost there," the man encouraged, his voice steady and reassuring. Luke didn't respond. He didn't care about praise or recognition. All he cared about was Frank and finding a way to save his life. Suddenly, Frank jerked, his body convulsing violently. A sharp cry of pain escaped his lips as his hands trembled uncontrollably. "He's having a seizure," Luke shouted, leaning over to steady Frank's body. "Hurry. We're running out of time." The driver pressed the gas pedal harder, the car jolting over the rough road with unsettling creaks and rattles. Luke felt his heart pounding against his chest. Every second felt critical, and any delay could render all his efforts meaningless. "Is he still breathing?" the driver asked, his voice tinged with worry. Luke leaned closer to check. Frank's breathing was faint but still present. He nodded, his eyes glimmering with a fragile hope. "Yes, but it's very weak. Please, faster." Ahead, the faint lights of a small medical station came into view. Luke shouted, his voice breaking with a mix of desperation and relief. "There it is. That's the medical station. Do you see it, Frank? We made it." Luke was nearly in tears, his voice trembling with emotion. Frank barely opened his eyes, catching a glimpse of the lights. A faint smile crossed his lips, but he lacked the strength to say anything. Luke gently patted his shoulder, as if willing him to keep fighting. Just a little more. You have to hang on. Luke said, his hands shaking with emotion. The car screeched to a halt in front of the medical station. Luke jumped out, yanked open the back door, and, with the driver's help, carefully carried Frank out of the vehicle. Medical staff rushed toward them, quickly placing Frank on a stretcher and assessing his condition. Get him to the emergency room, now, a nurse yelled, motioning for her colleagues. Luke stood nearby, watching as Frank was wheeled inside. His heart pounded erratically, his legs feeling too weak to move any further. He wanted to follow, to know what would happen, but the doors closed in front of him. You've done an incredible job, the driver said, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder with a comforting tone. Leave the rest to them. You need to rest now. Luke shook his head, his eyes locked on the doors. No. I can't rest until I know he's safe. The man looked at Luke, sensing the boy's determination. He knew that no words could convince Luke to leave at that moment. Time passed slowly. Luke sat in the waiting area, his hands on his knees, staring at the floor. Sounds from the emergency room filtered through the walls, but he couldn't understand what was happening inside. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the worry in his chest only grew heavier. Finally, the emergency room doors opened. A doctor stepped out, his expression serious. Luke jumped to his feet, running up to him. How is he? Did he make it? Luke asked, his voice trembling. The doctor looked at Luke for a moment, then placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. We've stabilized him. Thankfully, you acted quickly and got him here in time. If you had been even a little later, it might have been a different story. Luke let out a shaky breath, his entire body relaxing after the relentless tension. He nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. Thank you, doctor, he said, his voice catching in his throat. You don't need to thank me, the doctor replied. It's you who saved his life. Luke said nothing, but a wave of relief and gratitude washed over him. His efforts had not been in vain. The driver approached Luke, placing a hand on his shoulder. Kid, you're extraordinary. Without you, he might not have made it. Luke offered a faint smile and nodded. Thank you for stopping. I wouldn't have known what to do without your help. The driver looked at him with admiration. No, I should be thanking you. It's rare to see a boy as brave and determined as you. Do you know his name? Luke shook his head. All I know is his name is Frank. We've never met before. The driver was surprised. And yet you did all this to save him. That's truly remarkable. Luke didn't reply. Instead, he looked down at his shoes, now caked in mud. The compliments didn't sit well with him. All he wanted now was to go home, back to the quiet peace of his village. The man observed him for a moment and gently asked. Do you want to stay and visit him? When he wakes up, he'll surely want to thank you. Luke lifted his head, his eyes bright but resolute. There's no need. I just did what I had to do. He doesn't need to know who I am. The driver frowned, confused. But you saved his life. Why wouldn't you want him to thank you? Luke gave a faint, bittersweet smile. One day, he'll recover, and life will go back to normal. I don't want him to carry the burden of a debt he feels he needs to repay. Sometimes, doing good without leaving a trace is the best way. Without waiting for another word, Luke walked out of the waiting area of the medical station. The lights from outside illuminated his face, revealing the weariness etched across it after a long and grueling night. He stepped slowly through the glass doors, feeling the cold night air against his skin. Luke paused for a moment, turning back to glance at the emergency room where Frank was being treated. He had done something even many adults might hesitate to do, but he knew life would move on, and Frank would eventually forget him, like a shadow fading in memory. He walked down the dimly lit path, his footsteps echoing in the silence, a lonely but resolute melody. He thought of his father and his teachings. In life, you don't need to do grand things. Just do what is right and do it well, that is enough. Those words resonated more clearly in Luke's mind now than ever before. After several days of recovery in the hospital, Frank couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had saved him. The image of Luke, small yet unyielding, remained vivid in his memory. Every time he recalled Luke carrying him through the rough, dark road, Frank felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. As soon as Frank was able to leave his hospital bed, the first thing he did was ask his personal assistant to investigate the boy who had saved him. He didn't have much information, just the name Luke and the general rural area where the boy lived. After several days of searching, he received word, a boy named Luke lived with his mother in a small house amid wheat fields, about a 3-hour drive from the city. Frank's luxurious Maybach rolled along the bumpy road leading to the house. The scenery outside shifted from towering modern buildings to sprawling wheat fields stretching to the horizon. When the car stopped in front of a modest house with faded white walls, Frank felt a strange sense of peace from the surroundings. He stepped out of the car, straightened his expensive suit jacket, but couldn't hide his nervousness. Frank knocked on the door. After a moment, it creaked open, and a woman in her late 30s appeared. Her eyes briefly showed surprise at the sight of a well-dressed stranger standing at her doorstep. "Hello, I'm Frank. I'm here to see Luke," he said, his voice polite but laced with urgency. The woman looked Frank up and down, clearly unaccustomed to someone so refined appearing in this rural setting. "You're looking for Luke, my boy?" she asked, her tone both curious and cautious. Frank nodded, his gaze earnest. "Yes, I want to thank him for saving my life. If it weren't for Luke, I wouldn't be standing here today." The woman studied Frank for a moment, then gently shook her head. "A thank you is enough, sir. We don't need anything more." With that, she began to close the door. "Wait." Frank quickly interjected, his voice urgent. "I'm not here just to thank him. I want to repay his kindness. I owe him my life." The woman hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. A familiar young voice called from inside. "Mom, who's at the door?" The door opened wider, and Luke appeared. The same small frame, the same bright, intelligent eyes, but he looked thinner, and his skin was darker from the sun. When he saw Frank, Luke froze, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "Mr. Frank," he stammered. Frank bowed slightly, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Luke, I'm so happy to see you again. I can't forget what you did for me." Luke pressed his lips together and lowered his head. "You didn't have to come. I only did what I thought was right." Frank shook his head, his expression resolute. "You don't understand, Luke. I owe you my life. Without you, I wouldn't be here today." Luke's mother stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sir, we're grateful that you came, but as I said, Luke didn't do this expecting anything in return. We don't need any repayment." Frank looked directly at the woman, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand your concern, but please hear me out. I didn't come here just to repay a debt. I want to help your family so that Luke has a better future. This boy deserves the best life has to offer." The woman's expression turned contemplative, but she shook her head again. "We live simply, and that's enough for us. I don't want my son to think kindness should be repaid with material rewards." Luke spoke up, his voice firm. "Mom is right. I don't need anything, Mr. Frank. I just want everyone to be healthy and happy. That's what my father taught me." Frank stood still, deeply moved by the boy's resolve. He sighed, realizing it wouldn't be easy to convince them. But Frank wasn't one to give up easily. "Very well," he said gently but firmly. "I won't force anything. But I hope you and Luke will allow me the chance to help, should it ever be needed." The woman didn't reply, her expression unreadable. Luke stood by her side, his eyes showing a maturity far beyond his years. Frank bowed slightly before leaving, but in his heart, he resolved that this wouldn't be the end. On the drive back to the city, he brainstormed different ways to reach out to this small family, determined to find a meaningful way to honor Luke's kindness. Back in the city, Frank couldn't get Luke and his mother out of his mind. He began planning ways to approach them tactfully and effectively. He didn't want to simply repay them but genuinely hoped to help Luke and his mother in practical ways. The first week, Frank sent a small package to Luke's home. Inside was a handwritten letter and a new backpack for the boy. Frank wrote, "Luke, you saved my life, and I will never forget it. I'm sending you this backpack as a small token of my gratitude. I hope it will serve you well on the long journeys I believe you will continue to take in life. Stay as strong as you were when you saved me. Frank." A few days later, the backpack was returned, along with a neatly written note from Luke. "Dear Mr. Frank, thank you very much, but I can't accept this gift. I only did what anyone would have done in that situation. Please don't worry about me anymore. Luke." Frank smiled as he read the letter. Luke's integrity only strengthened his resolve. This time, he decided to visit in person. He wanted to speak with Luke's mother to learn more about their lives and find a way to help. When the Maybach appeared at Luke's house for the second time, his mother opened the door with an expression that was wary but not unfriendly. She invited Frank inside, where everything was modest but tidy. Frank noticed that every item in the house had been cared for meticulously, from the carefully patched tablecloth to the family photos on the wall. "Today, I didn't come to force anything on you," Frank began, his gaze sincere. "I only want to understand more about Luke and your family. To me, this boy didn't just save my life, he taught me a profound lesson about kindness and resilience." Luke's mother sat down on a chair, silently observing Frank. Finally, she spoke. "I deeply appreciate your sentiment, but as I've said before, Luke didn't do this expecting anything in return. We live simply, and that's enough for us. But don't you think Luke deserves a better education?" Frank asked gently. "He's intelligent, brave, and I believe that with some support, he could achieve incredible things." His mother hesitated. She knew Luke was a special child, but their life was simple, and she didn't want her son to be swept into the complexities of the outside world. "I don't want him to change," she said slowly. "I'm afraid the good qualities he has now might be lost." Frank nodded. "I understand your concern, but I don't want to change Luke. I want to give him opportunities to develop those good qualities further. I'm not here to impose, I just want to support, if you'll allow me." Their conversation stretched into the late afternoon. Luke sat silently, listening, occasionally glancing at his mother with understanding in his eyes. When Frank finally prepared to leave, Luke's mother sighed. "We'll think about what you've said. But I hope you understand that any help must come from goodwill, not out of obligation," she said. Frank smiled. "I only want the best for Luke and you." Over time, Luke and his mother grew accustomed to Frank's visits. He often stopped by with interesting stories and small gifts like books and school supplies, which he insisted were just to encourage Luke. Gradually, his sincerity and persistence began to change Luke's mother's attitude. One afternoon, as sunlight spread across the wheat fields, Frank visited again. This time, he brought a large bag filled with science books and a small telescope. Luke was immediately drawn to it but remained reserved. "I've always dreamed of seeing the stars clearly," Luke admitted, his eyes sparkling. "But Mom says dreams aren't always realistic." Frank knelt down, looking Luke in the eye. "Luke, you did something extraordinary, something very few people could do. So don't ever let anyone tell you your dreams aren't worth pursuing. Luke stayed silent, but his eyes shone with newfound confidence. From a distance, his mother watched the scene unfold, and for the first time, she felt her heart soften. After many nights of reflection, she decided to open up to Frank. The next day, she invited Frank to sit down for a conversation in their small kitchen. "Mr. Frank, I've thought about this a lot," she began. "You're right. Luke is a special child, and I don't want to limit his future out of fear. If you truly want to help, I'll accept. But under one condition." Frank leaned forward, ready to listen. "Please, go ahead." "I want Luke to understand that help is not something to take for granted," she said firmly. "He must learn to be grateful and use that gratitude to help others in the future." Frank smiled warmly. "That's exactly what I hope to teach him. You can rest assured." From that moment on, Frank began supporting Luke and his mother more concretely. He sponsored Luke to attend a prestigious high school in the city, where his talents could flourish. But Frank didn't stop at paying tuition. He regularly spent time with Luke, sharing life lessons, teaching him how to face challenges, and explaining the importance of helping others. At first, Luke remained distant, but he soon realized that Frank was different. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman, he was someone who deeply understood the value of sacrifice and courage. Frank became a mentor and a trusted friend to Luke. As time passed, the bond between Frank and Luke's family grew stronger. One weekend, Frank invited them to visit his home in the city. Luke couldn't hide his amazement as he stepped into the sprawling mansion with meticulously trimmed gardens and an enormous library. "Is this your house?" Luke asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "Yes," Frank replied with a gentle smile. "But a house is just bricks and mortar. What truly matters are the people inside it." Luke nodded as if he understood something profound. "Do you live here alone?" Frank was silent for a moment before nodding. "Yes. I've grown used to being alone. But sometimes, I think I've missed out on the things that really matter." His words lingered in Luke's mind throughout the afternoon. When the visit came to an end and Luke and his mother were about to leave, Luke turned back to Frank and said, "You haven't missed out on anything. You've done so much good, and that's what really matters." Frank looked at the boy, his heart swelling with emotion. Thanks to Luke, he had found new meaning in life. More than anything, he realized that this relationship was no longer about repaying a debt. It had become a bond between people who had shared a life-changing moment and forged a deeply human connection. From then on, Luke and his mother's lives took a positive turn. Luke excelled in school and became a dedicated companion to Frank. He often joined Frank in charitable projects, helping others in need. This journey became not just an act of repayment but a profound lesson in humanity and the power of kindness. Frank, once a man consumed by work, found joy and peace in helping Luke. And Luke, once a small-town boy, grew into a young man full of ambition and a willingness to help others. In the end, the three, Frank, Luke, and his mother, became a family not bound by blood but by sincerity and gratitude. Their story underscores the value of kindness, perseverance, and human connection. Luke, despite his small stature, taught Frank that courage and compassion can save lives and change people. Frank learned that the greatest wealth lies not in money or power but in genuine relationships. Kindness doesn't need material repayment, but gratitude and timely support can create incredible opportunities. Life becomes more meaningful when we're willing to help and inspire each other.